So as the title suggests, today we're going to talk about the right way to select web and digital marketing technology. And I know the description for this webinar really took a rather broad brush in terms of looking at different technology markets and investigating different technology markets. So I'm going to give you a high-level view of those markets and also help you hopefully get some clarity on some of what we consider the better ways to select a product, because it is a very, very big and crowded marketplace in terms of all the technology that's available today to help you be more agile with your web and your digital marketing content. So let's dive right in. Naz already gave you a little bit of a background about me. Just very quickly about Real Story Group. We primarily provide research where we look at products across these markets and we analyze the weaknesses and strengths of different technology tools. And then we have a consulting practice for our subscribers where we help them set forth technology strategy and select products and vendors that are most appropriate for their needs. And we are strictly buyer side, so we don't work with any of the vendors we evaluate. We're really in business to help buyers make the best possible technology decisions. One of the things that we use as a tool, as an overview of the market, a way of looking at both what we call the digital workplace and the marketing technology markets, is this subway map, or this tube map. If you happen to be over in the UK, this probably looks a little bit familiar to you, and we did indeed take this sort of look and feel directly from the London tube map. And this specifically gives an overview of all the vendors that we follow at Real Story Group. I shouldn't say all. We actually follow 248 vendors at last count, I think. And this is really a sampling of those vendors that we do look at. And today, we're really focused on this digital marketing world. And as you can see from the colored lines on the top left-hand side, there are a lot of different technology markets out there to help you manage, find, and produce marketing content, and also content about consumers and customers, but what we're focused on today is really the vendors that are on the light blue line, which is web content management. The vendors on the purple lines, you have what we call marketing automation and social media monitoring technology, and then finally we'll also look at a little bit around video management technology, since that has become such an important part of marketing today, producing and deploying video. So this really centers around customer experience, of course. Even though we're talking about digital marketing and web technologies, this is really about building a broader customer experience technology strategy. And with Naz and his group, and the way Congility is often doing education, is around how to structure your content, how to plan for your content, and make sure that it's agile and can go out to all these different sorts of technologies and then eventually to customers in different channels. And our firm is really focused on, what's the right tool for you in each of these areas, because this is really what builds into the holistic customer experience. And from our perspective, we see a lot of overlap in functionality when it comes to the different tools that offer these parts of the customer experiences. I often like to call this a cocktail. It's almost like you have to be a bartender who has to figure out, what's the best mix of different liquids that I'm putting into this drink. And it's the same thing with the customer experience. What's the best mix of technology, and does it actually blend well together? Is it going to come together effectively for you to be able to deliver on the best customer experience? So let's break this down a little bit. The whole goal of these technologies and bringing them together, of course, is to have the content for the total customer experience and to make sure that you can deliver it in a multi-channel way. So here's some examples of what multi-channel means today. We've obviously been talking about the web for a very, very long time, but today, of course, the sitting down at the desktop computer and looking at a full web browser is increasingly less common, or I should say decreasingly common, because people are using more mobile web technologies in particular. But beyond that, there's also still a big market out there for print. We can't forget that still exists. Even though it's decreasing, there's still a lot of that happening. There's still a big market also for managing packaging. This is an example from a video game. Naz had mentioned it worked with Ubisoft, so this is an example of one of their game packages. And sometimes when you're managing content in an agile way, it's often going out to a package as well as to the web, as well as to some kind of mobile experience. It's also going out to partners, so if you have retailers or you have places that you're syndicating your content, you need to think about that as well. And then finally, it's also going into tangible experiences. Some of the pictures on the top right here are specific brand immersion kind of experiences where you might actually be walking into some kind of studio where products are getting promoted, or maybe you're the marketer who has to plan some kind of promotional event. So often the content has to go out to a channel that's a physical, immersive channel as well. So the technology to support this, there's a lot of options out there. Okay, this is showing the sort of logo landscape of the different vendors that are out there. And as analysts, we like to slice and dice these into different categories, and we have different analysts who focus in these different categories. You know, my particular focus is particularly on digital asset management and media asset management, and I'll define a little bit better how that fits into the larger marketing picture in a minute. But also, you've got a bunch of vendors that focus very specifically on web content. More recently, they like to call themselves customer experience management vendors, but in reality, they're still really more about the web than anything else. And then really a newer market that's developed in the last 5 to 7 years is the two at the top, which is marketing automation and social media monitoring. And these are tools that I'll get into quite a bit of detail about today, since I'm sure there's particular interest among the digital marketers on the webinar. So let's talk about each of these different technologies and the scenarios that they target. I'm sure many of you are familiar with use case scenarios and what they mean and what they're about. If you're not, just very quickly, it's the idea of thinking about what is the end user going to try to accomplish when they are using this particular technology. So we're specifically talking about here developing websites, and with web content management, it's about the kind of website that you are trying to create. And this is the lens through which we evaluate the technologies in our research. So we say, when we look at a product, okay, is this product particularly good at producing simple sites, you know, for an affordable price? Or if I'm trying to develop a global enterprise marketing portal, that same technology probably isn't appropriate. So these scenarios here are listed because we look at every single product through this lens, and we say, okay, is this actually appropriate for what you're trying to do? So if you're looking at web content management products, you can see here, you know, there's some marketing focus here, but sometimes websites are about building a community, or sometimes they're specifically about e-commerce. Sometimes they're specifically around building an intranet, which is a little bit different from digital marketing. And we'll talk about how the digital marketing tools differ from, you know, buying a web content management system. Web content management systems are really still mostly about managing websites. So you have to be cautious when a web content management salesperson says, you know, this is also going to do marketing automation for you, and it's going to send emails for you, and it's going to manage some of your customer data for you. That may be true to a very limited extent, but it's still not really fundamentally what these systems are engineered to do. So here's the segue into digital marketing tools and the scenarios that they fulfill specifically. So the digital marketing tools are much more about specific marketing objectives. Okay, so first might be that you need to monitor what's going on social media. Let's say you want to monitor what's being said about your brand on Twitter, what's being said at a certain hashtag thread about your brand. What are bloggers saying about your brand? What are they saying about your competitors? So that's what social media monitoring and intelligence is about. It's about technology going out there, gathering information, and bringing it back to you. And then in some cases, actually developing a circle of customer support and feedback loop so you can go back to them on social media and, in fact, respond, engage, etc. Then there's a world around lead nurturing, and I'll get into some detail about that in a minute. And then all of these tools specifically emphasize or support certain channels. So there's some technologies that are very focused on email campaigns, some that are very focused on mobile, and then others that are more socially oriented. And then there's sort of bigger, more complex ones that are more multi-channel oriented, where if you have a campaign that you want to put out across many channels, then you probably have to step up your game in terms of what you're buying and what you're implementing. Finally, we have completely different scenarios for the world of digital asset management or media asset management. And once I'm through these, we'll look at some of the specific functionality that they offer. With these particular technologies, we're really going back to kind of old school publishing in many ways, or just having a library to manage your images. And then there's a whole world that's around video management. So there's a pretty long list of scenarios here because DAM and MAM tools, many of them have been around for 20, even 25 years to support broadcasting, to support catalog production, and to support old school just brochure creation for simple marketing scenarios. Now the trick with modern marketing, of course, and modern digital marketing is that you often have to bring together all these things into a multi-channel campaign that involves your website, that involves a marketing email automation campaign, that involves social promotion, and then sometimes also involves creating a brochure that you want to give out at a conference. So it's not just a one technology solution anymore when we talk about digital marketing. It's often a cocktail, as I mentioned, bringing together these different ingredients in the most effective way to really make your content more easily distributable and more agile across all these different channels. So when you think about choices, when you think about choosing these technologies, there's not one that's perfect. There's no single technology that's going to solve all of your web and digital marketing needs. So some people ask, okay, should I buy a best of breed in each category, or should I buy a suite of products? Should I go to Adobe or IBM or Oracle and just buy everything that they have in their marketing cloud, for example? And there's not one right way to answer that. The question is really, it depends. So among these different technologies, let's break this down now into more specific functionality. So I talked about the use cases they're trying to fulfill. In terms of the functionality these tools offers, there's quite a bit of overlap. So first we're going to talk about marketing automation and social media monitoring. So I mentioned that the social media monitoring and intelligence and bringing back customer data, looping back into customer support is core functionality there. However, you might be using a marketing automation tool to create an integrated campaign that sends promotional information or brand information out via these multiple channels: email, mobile, social, print. And then you might be going out, sending that out to social media, having a feedback loop back to, say, a landing page, for example, where you're starting to collect data about those prospects or those customers, and then you're going to manage and nurture those leads potentially in the same system. So there's this circle here of sort of functional overlap, but everything that's happening on the right is feeding back to what's happening in your marketing automation tool, ideally, if you're doing it right. You're monitoring, you're watching, and then you're gathering customer data and nurturing and managing those leads on an ongoing basis. I'll show a couple screenshots what that looks like. So the question is, does web content management kind of fit into this mix? The reality is yes, it does to an extent, but functionally, there is a lot of overlap because your web content management system might also offer functionality to manage a landing page, and it might generate a specific URL for you that you can put in your email campaign that then will track where these specific prospects came from. So the trick here, and the reason why I show these overlapping circles, is because you specifically have to choose what is your system of record to do what. Okay, so you could decide, I'm going to manage my landing pages on my web content management system, or you could say, no, I'm going to have this landing page specifically managed by my marketing automation tool. And that's where you have to figure out the balance, and you have to say, okay, this is the tool that's going to do this is the other tool that's going to do that, and then pick what's most appropriate for what you're functionally looking for. And today, the cloudiness of this situation is that sometimes people own all three of these tools, and then they don't make that decision, and then there's a lot of confusion as to, oh, is that happening over in my MA tool, or is that happening in my WCM? So you, as a digital marketing leader, need to be driving those sorts of decisions and make sure that everyone's on the same page as far as what is being used for what. So as I mentioned, web content management is still fundamentally about managing web content. There are a lot of vendors out there that are offering very basic campaign management tools, very basic social media publishing tie-ins, and it's similar to what the marketing automation tools offer, as I mentioned. So before you move into buying one tool or the other, if you already have one tool or the other, make sure you have a clear and complete understanding of what your existing tool already does. Odds are you already have a web content management system. It's a rare organization today that does not have one. So if you're looking at moving into more marketing automation, more mobile publishing, more having to do with social media publishing, look at your existing WCM and decide to what extent is that going to fulfill your needs. And then look at how a marketing automation tool might be able to supplement that or help you exceed way beyond the capabilities of your web content management tool. And then if you are going to stick with the WCM you have, make sure you're looking at what's going to integrate well and what's going to be able to easily pass content back and forth to ensure that your campaigns are successful. It's a pretty long functional list of features and functions in a WCM, and I put this here because the things on the right are where the sort of confusion happens. But specifically with web content management tools, I should say, the publishing as well as the sort of workflow pieces that are unique to web publishing are what you're going to find in these tools that you're not necessarily going to find in a completely separate digital marketing tool. All right, let's specifically look at these tools in the digital marketing landscape that we separate, as I mentioned, into marketing automation and social media monitoring and intelligence. And this is a slice from our subway map. If you'd like a copy of the subway map, by the way, you can just go to realstorygroup.com/subwaymap, and then you'll be able to see all the different vendors on the different lines that we offer evaluations of. So let's define this a little bit more specifically. Social media monitoring, as I mentioned, this is monitoring what people say about your brand. It's also benchmarking your offering against your competitors, so gathering feedback on what people are saying. You've rolled out a new product. What's the word on the street as far as what's going on? And then if somebody's complaining about your product, resolve. How do you handle that? I admit I use Twitter a lot now to get feedback and response and engage, because sending an email is frankly much less speedy in terms of getting a response, because people can ignore it. You get out there on social media, if you're complaining about something, you're going to get a quicker response because everybody's watching, right? So the companies tend to be very conscious of that. Gathering competitive intelligence, finding out who's influencing your brand. So if somebody's saying a lot of positive things about you and your company and what's going on, you can nurture them and potentially get them to say more good things. And then also increasing leads and pulling those in, and then running campaigns on social media. So that's what social media monitoring is all about. Now, with the marketing automation, once you get this information, you need to build and enrich and promote those leads. You bring them into a marketing database. You've got individuals that you're going to nurture and continue to send mail to. If we're talking about B2B, these systems are really about Salesforce automation and customer relationship management. So a typical example of this is Salesforce. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. In a B2C scenario, usually you're using it as sort of a specialized offer or arbitration engine. So if you're a retailer or you're selling a consumer product, you're going to more use marketing automation to essentially bombard your audience with compelling reasons to come back and buy from you. So there's a little bit of nuance there as well. And some vendors are focused on B2B, others are focused on B2C. There's elements to nurturing leads, and this is a funnel that shows essentially what this technology is doing for you. When you get the leads in, you're generating those leads via your campaigns. You're capturing those leads. You're getting more and more data about them as you send them more information. You see what they click on. You learn kind of what they're looking at on your website, and then you have to nurture those with further interaction, further campaigns. And then finally, once you're able to segment those different audience groups, you can personalize your messaging specifically to them. And then finally, especially in B2B scenarios, you can even score the value of those leads. So what are the odds we're going to close business with this person? How can we actually figure out what they're thinking of us, right now, based on how they're interacting with us and the last phone call we might have had with them? So it's this funnel of getting this input and getting these leads into an actual, paying customer. This is what this technology is particularly about. So honing in on that larger logo graphic that I showed before, here's specifically the vendors that, as I would say, are best of breed in these spaces. Okay, so if you're looking really at social media marketing versus social media analytics, you can see there's different vendors here, right? Then there's suites. Okay, and I'll talk about suites in a second. These are big vendors that sell a lot of technology across probably many of the different areas in which you work. So you could buy a social media marketing tool from these big vendors. You could buy an analytics tool from these vendors, but it's not necessarily best of breed, and you will probably be sold to very heavily in terms of buying lots of other things that a vendor like IBM or Adobe would offer, as an example. The vendors across the bottom are very specialized in digital marketing overall. So they do both media marketing as well as analytics, as well as email automation. And so that's more of a sort of broad brush there, that vendors that are focused on digital marketing. So let me talk briefly about suites, which I said I was going to do. The important thing to note about suites, we often say that suites aren't always sweet. So suite, S-U-I-T-E, are not always as wonderful as they come off. So this is an example of IBM, Oracle, and Adobe here. They sell huge packages of marketing technology. Most of these are results of an acquisition, whereby these large vendors bought small best-of-breed vendors, and then they package them together and say, okay, if you want something for email marketing and interactive marketing and personalization and lead management, and social media monitoring and all this stuff, just spend $1 million and you'll get all this. The reality is that these technologies often are just as disconnected as if you went to each individual vendor and bought a best of breed. Because this is a very new world. Bringing these things together for these large enterprise vendors is very new for them. And the history of these vendors is often hardcore databases or hardware. It's not the modern world of digital marketing. So if you are going to go to one of these large vendors, be cautious. Know that these are not necessarily fabulously integrated suites, and it's not necessarily less work for you to work with one large vendor versus a set of smaller ones. And if you have questions specifically on any of these, please feel free to type them into the panel, and I'll address them at the end. So now let's talk briefly about digital and media asset management. So DAM specifically is focused on images and still media, whereas MAM is focused on time-based media and audio-video. These are the use cases for that world, as I mentioned. Let's dive right in here and look at the this particular vendor marketplace, and then I'll go into some methodologies on selection to wrap up. Specifically with DAM, as I mentioned, there's a history of print here. These vendors really came out of the desktop publishing world and large-scale publishing world, and also a whole different breed, which is the media asset management, which came out of the video and digital editing world. So note that many of these vendors are newer to digital. They really came into it in the last 5 or 7 years. So some of the web content management vendors you're working with might have a much better grip on the digital world than your typical DAM vendor would. Here's the vendors honing in on this particular market. You've got broadcast ones that are focused on long-form digital video media. You've got large-scale enterprise DAM, which is essentially vendors that will manage hundreds of thousands to millions of images, if that's your world, as well as complex Adobe Creative Suite files for print destinations or for packaging sorts of outputs. And then finally, mid-scale enterprise and workgroup DAM. These are vendors that are very specifically focused on image management for mid to small companies. These companies sell software. They're focused, and this is essentially their world is DAM and MAM. There's also a market around video, online video platforms. You've probably heard of a lot of these. These are the alternatives to YouTube. I know I've got YouTube on here, but a lot of organizations aren't necessarily comfortable using a consumer video platform to manage their corporate video. So these are options if you're looking in that world to think about hosting your own video in a very secure and video-oriented environment. And these tools also integrate very well with web content management tools. Finally, there's a whole market around managing your internal video. So if you're a large global company, you might record your CEO conference call, you might have town halls, and you might be needing to do a global interactive sort of scenario with your colleagues in terms of video conferencing, whatever it might be. These are vendors that focus specifically on that, and these are called enterprise video platforms. And in some cases, these companies sell hardware in addition to the software. So that's a whole world that's really separate from all the marketing automation that I was talking about and social media monitoring I was talking about. Okay, to close out, I'm going to talk about selection methodology. So hopefully I've given you a good broad brush of the differences in marketing automation technology versus web content management versus DAM. So how do you select these tools? All right, you're in a situation where you know that you need to do web content management better. You know that you need to do marketing automation better, and we've been in business almost 12 years now, and this is really the focus of what we do in terms of helping companies pick the right product. And this is the history that we've seen in this world as to how people tend to select products, and we don't believe that any of these are the right way. First is the horse race. That is, you go and you buy a whole bunch of research, or you go out on the web and you say, who is the best vendor? The reality is there's no best vendor out there. And there's hundreds to choose from, as I hope I've adequately communicated thus far. There's hundreds of vendors that you can choose from, and what's right for somebody else or some other organization is not necessarily right for you. So that's the problem with just asking, who is the best vendor. You need to think about what's a fit for your current situation, what's going to integrate best with your other technologies that you already have in place, what makes sense for your content, how it's structured, how you want it to work. And all that is going to vary from company to company. There's not just one best fit. The second thing that we often see is this blind love. Somebody comes in, gives a really sexy demo, and it looks awesome, and people write a check. That's also a mistake, because you really don't know if that fits your scenarios necessarily. You don't necessarily know if it integrates well in your environment. So that's another mistake that we often see. Third is, my buddy. I'm going to buy from my buddy because I play golf with him, or we're a member of the same club, or he hangs out in my bar with me, and he happens to sell software. We see that a lot too. So that's another mistake, and we oftentimes are pulled in when there's a marketing manager or a CMO who says, my boss bought the wrong technology, and I need to replace it, and he bought the wrong technology because he bought it from some guy he plays golf with. So nothing against golfers, I'm a golfer, but that's often where the business gets done, so you have to be careful about that as well. And then the fourth thing that we see that's also often a mistake is what we call happiness is a big stack of warm binders. And this is when people send out giant RFPs that are hundreds of pages that end up just resulting in big documents back from vendors that just say, yes, 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 we do all of this, without really saying how they do it. And that's the important thing, is not so much the fact that these vendors are obviously what they do is similar. If you look at a particular space like marketing automation, what these vendors do is essentially the same. The difference is not what they do, it's how they do it. So that's something that the traditional RFP process is not very good at uncovering and figuring out. So we propose a different approach to this. And I'll just walk you through this approach and this methodology, and I'm sure many of you have done some of this before, but if you are in a very traditional organization that insists on doing procurement with big documents of requirements and big lists of requirements, you might think about proposing some of these alternative approaches. So I'll go through each of these. Needs analysis, scenario development. So the reason I started this webinar talking about scenarios is because that's really the key to understanding if vendors meet your needs. It's not long lists of functionality. Because if you're looking for a marketing automation tool, yes, they all send email. But how do they send email? What kind of segmentation do they allow you to do? Is that going to fit your particular scenario? So if you describe in a narrative way what you want, you're going to get a much better sense of whether this tool fits your particular needs. Then you look at the market. Then when you send out an RFP, or a tender as we say in the UK, you need to very, very specifically be concise, be brief, be specific. I tend to have a 15-page rule. I say if it's longer than that, it's way too long. And then go into demos and eventually a proof of concept. So let me talk about this in detail, and then I'll be happy to take questions. Products versus platforms. This is an important distinction as well. A lot of people overbuy in this industry. So when I say products, I mean simple, out-of-the-box tools that work quickly, that are not very customizable. Most organizations immediately gravitate towards platforms, which is, well, it's very malleable, I can customize it. The IT leadership says, we can meet future demands, we can meet future needs, this is awesome, let's do that. But they tend to overspend. And the reality is a lot of companies that buy platforms, they end up using 20% of the functionality, and then they're spending a lot more than they needed to. So I would say, look at what's the most appropriate for your basic needs, and then decide, do I really need something that's heavily customizable, rather than overbuy. It's the number one problem we see is companies overbuying. So it's kind of like if you're going to buy a platform, it's almost like this. It's like buying a car in pieces, and you have to figure out how to assemble it. If you're a marketer yourself and you don't have a lot of IT support, this is not the best approach, right? If you don't have the budget to outsource the implementation, or if you don't have a team that's going to maintain a complex product, don't buy one. I spend a lot of time trying to convince marketers not to buy a tool that they don't have the staff or the budget to maintain. So just like if I was to buy a car in this state, I wouldn't be able to assemble it. I would need to hire a bunch of mechanics. So just caution you if you're going to go that path. If you're buying a simpler product, such as, for example, a hosted software as a service email automation tool that only costs a couple of $1,000 or euros or quid a month, you might have a much easier situation where you can just get in the car and start driving. So one isn't necessarily better than the other, but one is definitely more appropriate for you than the other. So be honest with yourself about the support staff you need and what you're going to be able to do there. I won't get into too much detail here. This just describes kind of a little bit more the segmentation of the market and where the vendors are falling in these different spaces. But if you have questions about this, feel free to give it a full read. If you go back after the recording, you can definitely pop me an email, and I'd be happy to answer questions. So here's the process, just visualized a little differently. Thinking about your shortlist, sending that RFP out, going through demos, and I'm going to talk about demos and bake-offs now to close out. So when you have a sales guy come in, this is why it's very important to have use case scenarios. Salespeople tend to come in and talk about very sexy stuff. They talk about social and mobile and cloud and sentiment analysis, and it all sounds very good and very slick. But what often matters to you and what leads to the success of an implementation is things that are not particularly sexy that the salesperson isn't going to tell you about. Things like workflow, version control, content models, and taxonomies, and metadata, and all that sort of stuff. So make sure that your scenarios focus on the stuff that's not so sexy, because the salesperson isn't necessarily going to talk about those. When the vendor comes in for a demo, they should actually be demonstrating your use cases to you rather than demonstrating some generic tool. So you need to say, okay, is this technology a scenario fit, right? So when they come in and they're showing it to you, make sure you see your scenario. Is it a technology fit? So if you're a Microsoft organization and it's a Java-based tool, it's probably not right for you. Be honest with what your technology team is capable of, and if you don't have a technology team, make sure you understand what you're in for. Partner fit. Is this a good partner? Do they understand me? Do they understand my organization? Do I actually want to work with this team for the next 5 to 7 years, which is sort of the typical life cycle of one of these technologies? So make sure you understand that. And then finally, value. Does it fit your budget? Does it actually make sense for you, your organization? These are what we see as the fit and getting to the right fit, rather than just saying, what's the best vendor and just letting them do an open-ended demo and deciding what looks the most sexy. Focus on these things and you'll come to a better decision. And this breaks this down a little bit more specifically in terms of what's the best fit for you. If you're in Europe and you have a team of .NET developers and you want an inexpensive commercial product on-premise, that's going to help you get to the right vendor a lot more quickly, and to focus on that will help you get to the right vendor more quickly. Make sure you have an interdisciplinary team. Don't just have the marketing people or don't just have the IT people. Make sure you're covering a broad brush across your organization. I mentioned the RFPs. Don't go overboard here. Focus on your next process. What do you want your process to be like? you basically describe your dream. This is your opportunity to think big. This is your opportunity to describe where you want to go with your marketing goals. Run that demo. Make sure it's not canned. Make sure it's your scenarios. And this is where you have the opportunity to ask, tough and focused questions in terms of what you want out of this vendor. And this is the time to start negotiating about pricing. Just make sure you don't just call them up and say, show us your product. Send them your scenarios. Have them show you their scenarios or your scenarios. Finally, that should help you get down to 1 or 2 vendors that make sense. And then as a final step, what we recommend is having a bake-off. And this is where you take your 2 most appropriate vendors and you say, okay, who's the best? Let's actually test it with our users, with our tech team, in a real environment with our content. And this also gives you just a view into what it's actually going to be like. And you can actually take this POC and it goes right into a pilot, gives you time to negotiate with the vendor. And many people say, well, this is expensive, this takes time, I'm not sure it's worth it, but it's much more expensive if you pick the wrong technology. So take the time to do this. It's really effective, and oftentimes when I'm involved with a POC, I see the vendor that wasn't necessarily in the lead end up winning because when the rubber meets the road or when people actually start looking at the technology, it's a very different experience than watching a demo. So be sure to test drive the technology and make sure it's right for you. As I mentioned, this is the time to negotiate. So this is where you have to understand, how do these vendors license? Is it per seat? Is it per server? Is it by the amount of content that I put into it? Is it based on module? And different vendors increasingly have completely inconsistent licensing models. So you might be comparing 2 vendors at the end, and one prices per user or per seat, and the other one prices per CPU or server. And then meanwhile, there's another one that wants to charge you based on the amount of content you have in it. So it's hard to compare apples to apples when you get to this stage. So you have to normalize that. We spend a lot of time doing this for our customers and our research subscribers because it's tough to really look forward and say, okay, here's the ones that specifically allow us to compare apples to apples and say, okay, if we have this amount of content, this number of users, this is what vendor A is going to charge versus what vendor B is going to charge. So make sure that you line that up and have a really clear sense of what the total cost of ownership is of the solution. Negotiate. Pricing is always negotiable, especially if you're a big company with a big brand. You've got more negotiating power, and vendors will come in with very high pricing in those sorts of situations. So it's get your negotiation smarts on and be sure to do it right. Here's just a few examples of use case scenarios. So if you're looking for what a use case scenario might look like, here's a web content management one. So this is the kind of thing you want to have in your RFP. Rather than long lists of requirements, put something like this in here where you're describing who the person is, who the user is, and how they're using the website, how they're using that CMS. Here's another example that's just a little bit more detail in terms of if something doesn't fit in a use case. You might specifically want to describe how you want something functional to work, how something should integrate with WordPress, for example, if that's what you're trying to do, if that's your CMS and you're looking at a marketing automation tool. But again, it's not a long list of requirements that describes the what, it's description that describes the how. So I'll say that one more time. It's not about the what, it's about the how. So make sure that you're covering both those things. And then finally, don't just look at the product, look at the vendor, right? Do they have good professional services? Do they have partners that are going to support you? Is there a community out there so that if you have a question, you can go out and ask the question, especially if it's an open source project, you need to make sure that that's the case. Is their strategy solid? Are they a viable and stable vendor? This is just as important as the functionality of the tool, so don't forget to look at these factors as well. There it is one more time. Test along the way. So this is a testable process as you go down, and this process of elimination really helps you get to the best vendor most appropriately. One thing you might want to do is select the tool and the integrator at the same time. So this is just an example of how that might work. Okay. Sometimes when you send an RFP to a vendor, they will come back with a service provider. So this is a case. Next week, I'm going to be with one of our clients. who's doing this, where they're considering 3 digital asset management vendors, but in all 3 cases, they're coming in with a system integrator. So you're really picking 2 at the same time. And so that's something that you can think about as well, not just picking the technology, but picking your support staff and your services provider at the same time. This compares the traditional approach versus the iterative test-based approach. So I talked about why we believe the second one is better, because it's iterative, it's test-based, it's a more agile methodology. And I think we used agile in the first 30 seconds of this webinar, so we'll come back to that. You should be agile in your way of picking a tool as well. You get more value out of it, you learn more lessons, and when you start the actual implementation, you have a much better sense of what you're in for if you've tested the technology and you've gone through this process. Okay, here's one more view of it. I think this is my last slide, which breaks down the steps. So I talked about at the beginning those five to six main steps. So the first 5 areas here is the procurement and then getting into your launch. Again, I won't read through all these today because I do want to leave a bit of time at the end if anybody has questions. But this is really the more granular view of the most appropriate way to buy enterprise software. And of course, we at Real Story Group, because this is what we focus on as a business, we've honed this over the years, and as market experts in these particular spaces, we believe that going into the detail around the marketplace, understanding your scenarios and how those particular tools map to those scenarios is really the key to success. There we go. Okay, so here's a summary. Hopefully this covers everything that I said. Make sure you don't limit your choices up front. There's a lot of viable alternatives out there. Make sure that you're honest with yourself about where you are on the complexity spectrum. So when I showed that products versus platforms, don't overbuy. If you don't have a complex situation, don't buy a complex tool. If a bicycle is good enough, don't buy a Ferrari, as I often say. Don't fall victim to overbuying. Make sure that you realize that some of the biggest name vendors are not necessarily the most appropriate ones for you. Mobile and multi-channel output is really, really important to understand how it's working with your web content management system. So involve your architects. Don't leave them on the side. Make sure that you're wary of these big marketing suites from WCM vendors because they probably aren't as focused and specialized as the other marketing vendors that I talked about. Make sure you take an empirical and test-based approach to the services and the technology selection, and then finally, hold that bake-off in your kitchen with particular emphasis on your content, your scenarios, and the user experience in particular. And that is what I have for today. Thank you very much.